Hello, this is Scott Williams. Welcome to Fact, Faith, and Feeling. We try to figure out what's part of fact, what requires faith, and what requires feeling. Well, in these next few episodes, we're going to explore the questions that AronRa has asked in his fifth foundational falsehood of creationism, which says that evolution is the religion of atheism. And connected to this is his sixth foundational falsehood, the idea that evolution must account for the origin of life, the universe, and everything. So in this episode, we're going to continue with that question. Why do creationists say evolution is a religion? In the last episode, we talked that evolution was a cause, a principle, or an activity pursued with zeal. In this episode, we're going to talk about the question, does evolution require faith? Or in other words, do evolutionists believe in things just beyond the evidence? Let's learn together. So, why do creationists say evolution is a religion? Well, this first idea, a cause, a principle, or an activity pursued with zeal, that's one of the things I found over and over again. Well, the second reason is this idea of faith. If faith enters into science, that becomes a religious idea and it stops being a scientific idea. What is faith? Well, faith is a noun, and it means confident belief in the truth, value, or trustworthiness of a person, an idea, or a thing. Belief that does not rest on logical proof or material evidence. And number 4 of our list was the theological virtue defined as secure belief in God. So these kinds of things, the first one is confident belief in the truth. So you're believing in something that's just beyond the evidence. Number 2, doesn't rest on logical proof. But the object of your faith is very important. If the object of your faith is trustworthy, you can trust what they say. So this is the definition of faith according to the dictionary. Joe McMaster in his interview with Ken Miller in defense of evolution. Ken Miller said this, "Now, I'm a scientist and I have faith in God, but that doesn't make faith a scientific proposition. Faith and reason are both necessary to the religious person for a proper understanding of the world in which we live. And there's ultimately no necessary contradiction between reason and faith." So in other words, they're in different realms. Faith and science operate different realms. And as we'll learn, this is what creationists are saying. If there's faith in the scientific method concerning evolution, then that would make it a religious proposition by their definitions themselves. So is this true? Is there faith as part of the evolutionary theory? Kenneth Miller goes on to say that faith and reason are both gifts from God, and they should complement each other. Cameron Smith says this, "First, science is not a faith. It demands evidence for claims, whereas in direct opposition, faith means to believe without evidence." AronRa would continue this thought by saying, "Faith assumes its own conclusions. Faith is a great way to stay wrong forever. If you already know the conclusion, you're not going to do the research to figure out if it's true." AronRa continues, "Creationists know science isn't based on faith but they say it is anyway. And in my research, what I've found out about creationists, they would say this is a very untrue thing to say. That they're saying that parts of science do have elements of faith. So they don't know that science isn't based in faith. They're saying, yes, parts of science, especially dealing with evolution, have elements of faith. Which one is true? So let's listen from a Kent-Hovind debate as adversaries say that you can't rely on just faith.
Keep insisting that the God of the Bible in some way is responsible for all this. You may, even if you were to prove that there's some kind of spiritual force, it is not necessarily the God of the Bible. So you're taking a giant leap there. So I think there's a lot of that has to do with lots of faith that has to be developed in there. And I see that from our group here. And I think Mark Twain said about faith that faith is believing something you know ain't true. I don't think you can rely on faith. I think you need to, if you want to be honest, intellectually honest, you've got to come up with something a little bit more solid than just to buy in to the fact that 80% of U.S. Americans are God believers and only 14% are not.
So their point was, you can't just rely on faith. You can't just buy into the system of creationism and now you have evidence. You need more than just faith. Well, let's listen to Kent-Hovind, and he says there are many things part of evolution that we take on faith.
Your question, if you're going back to, you didn't like my answer of how God did it. God is outside of time, space, matter. I think you need to stop and look at the theory that you are believing in, apparently, because there are so many thousands of unanswered questions. See, it's much easier for me to believe in the beginning God than to believe in the beginning dirt or matter. The evolutionist does not answer the question. There's 6 different types of evolution, as I shared clearly earlier. If the Big Bang Theory is true, then I would like to know what exploded and where did it come from and where did the energy come from and where did the space come from for the matter to expand into and where did the organization come from and where did the information come from. There's a whole host of questions that are a whole lot harder for you to answer than in the beginning God. Where's information come from? This universe is not just random molecules circulating around. I mean, it carries information. Just like a book is so much more than ink on a paper. It carries information. And the DNA is more than just chemicals. It's information. So the evolutionist never answers the question, where did this information come from? Where did the energy come from? Where did the matter itself come from? And you gripe about my belief. I believe by faith in the beginning God. I know, I admit I don't understand that. But you believe hundreds of things by faith. You don't even understand that you're believing by faith. You think matter is either eternal or can create itself. What's the 2 choices? How did matter get here? The world is here. Where did the matter come from? Did it just happen by itself? Or is it all just imaginary? We're not really here at all. You're faced with the option of, we're not really here, this is all just our imagination, or it had a beginning, or matter is eternal, which is both of the second 2 options are in violation of the obvious laws of thermodynamics. Matter doesn't create itself. And everything degrades over time. So either it had a beginning or it didn't. If it had a beginning, then what was before the beginning? I mean, there's so many thousands of things you take by faith. I say in the beginning God, and you say, well, this matter somehow either was always here or created itself. And then this matter somehow became alive. And then this first living thing learned how to reproduce. And then it learned how to make something other than its kind. I mean, even though nobody's ever seen that, nobody's ever seen a dog produce a non-dog. Or you mentioned about, the fact that a wolf and a fox and a dog coming from a common ancestor off Noah's Ark in only 4,400 years. For heaven's sake, you believe they came from a rock. I mean, come on. I don't think my theory is that silly at all.
Let's see if what he says is true. So, Kent-Hovind here is directly challenging those thoughts. Remember before we said that first, science is not a faith. It demands evidence for claims, whereas in direct opposition, faith means to believe without evidence. And he's saying there's parts of evolution that are part of faith. There's no evidence for them. The evolutionists themselves claim that there's no evidence for it. So if that's true, then that means that that's part of faith. We learned before that the evolutionists say that faith assumes its own conclusions. So that's what creationists are saying, that evolutionism assumes its own conclusions. Its basis is that evolution is right, and so they look at evidence and conclusions based on the presupposition that evolution is true. Creationists know science isn't based on faith. And again, Ken Hovind is directly challenging that. He's saying that no, creationists are stating that parts of science are based on faith. And then this video we watched that you can't rely on faith. Well, if part of evolution is based on faith, then you can't just rely on that. Why are they saying that it's a part of fact if part of what they're saying is based on faith? You can't have it both ways. You can't say that creationism is based on faith, so it can't be part of science. But parts of evolution are based on faith, but it can be part of science. You have to be consistent. What does the scripture say? Romans 1:17 says this, "For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." So one thing we learn is that in the creationist viewpoint, that God loves faith. Other parts he tells us that the creation will show us God's infinite power, but God also loves faith. In Hebrews chapter 11, we have this famous verse about faith. It says this, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see." This is what the ancients were commended for. So again, they're believing in something just beyond the evidence. And they're saying that we can have confidence in this, even though it's just beyond the evidence. If we look at it from that Christian perspective, the world starts to make sense, is the claim. It goes on to say, by faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. So again, this is beyond the evidence. This would be impossible to prove scientifically, because it happened before all that we can see. But it says clearly that what we can see was not made out of what was visible. The material world is not eternal. It had a point in time where it was created. But this is a faith statement. This is not something that's provable by science. So this is where creationists have to clearly admit this is part of their religion, part of their religious belief. You can test, as we said before, the effects of this statement. Was the world made out of the material that we see? So we have this thought that, is it a leap of faith or is it a step of faith? A leap of faith, it's not connected very well to the evidence that we see. It's a huge jump in faith. But a step of faith, it's directly connected to the evidence. It just takes a little bit of faith to move you forward. Creationists are claiming that their viewpoint is just a step of faith. It's not a leap, it's just a step. So do evolutionists believe in things just beyond the evidence? Is the question they're being asked by creationists. Lee Strobel, in his book, The Case for a Creator, in his cumulative case for a creator, he says, to believe in the Darwinism hypothesis, you have to believe that nothing produced everything. Non-life produces life. Randomness produces fine-tuning. Chaos produces information. Unconsciousness produces consciousness. non-reason produces reason. They're saying you can't just assume these things. Those are beyond the evidence. Those are based on your worldview. So if you believe in pure naturalism, you'd have to come up with some sort of naturalistic explanation. So these are things just beyond the facts. Lee Strobel goes on to say that it requires a blind leap of faith, not a step of faith, but a blind leap of faith. Non-living chemicals produce the first cell. That's a blind leap of faith. Well, in his sixth foundational falsehood, AronRa is trying to make the case that evolution must account for the origin of life, the universe, and everything. And that's not part of evolution. So is that a good point? AronRa goes on to say that he's saying the creationist insists that evolution means the godless origin of life. But he says how it got here, how life got here, is not related to how it evolved. Creationists insist life from non-life. Evolution is concerned with how it diversified, not how it began. Well, from Answers in Genesis, they had this to say. Evolutionists often claim that the theory of evolution has nothing to do with the origin of life. They argue that evolution only deals with issues of the changes in organisms over time. They contend that life has progressed through purely naturalistic means without any supernatural intervention. However, if they argue that life progresses by purely naturalistic mechanisms, then they must also delineate a natural process by which life came into being. So in other words, you can't just assume a naturalistic origin when there is no evidence to support it. So you're assuming something with no evidence, and this is the very definition of faith, which evolutionists are claiming not to have. Russ Miller, in his 50 Facts versus Darwinism in the textbook, he has this to say.
Well, let's get into the textbooks. Let's go on beyond the Big Bang. They say that this nothingness blew up, and 4.6 billion years ago, a big ball of rock formed. And oceans formed as it rained on the rock for millions of years of time. Now, you should realize, I used to be a theistic evolutionist. That's a person that tries to blend evolution into the Bible. So I'm not here to attack anyone that believes in evolution or millions of years. I'm here to help them if they're truly seeking the truth of God's Word. But I like to kid folks and say, just to get them to realize how silly this is, and I'll say, you guys think we evolved from a rock. And they'll say, no, we don't. I'll say, sure, nothing blew up, the Big Bang, a big rock formed, and it rained on the rock for millions of years, and poof, here we are. Isn't that Darwinism in a nutshell? Well, that's exactly Darwinism in a nutshell. Well, what about the law of biogenesis, a principle of real biology, which is that life only comes from already living matter? So how do they get life started, since we started out with nothing but sterile non-life? Well, they teach that, well, kids, the first living organism was nothing complex. It was a simple little single-cell creature like a bacteria cell. Well, and from there, of course, it evolved into everything on Earth. In fact, if you look at this textbook, it tells the kids, all the many forms of life on Earth today are descended, stated as a fact, from a common ancestor found in a primitive population of unicellular organisms. Well, how is a kid supposed to argue with that? And they've just taught as a fact that everything evolved from that first simple cell creature. And what proof do they have of that? Well, they tell you that 2 sentences later. No traces of those events remain. There's not a shred of evidence that any of this took place. They're teaching it, and it is a religious belief, not science. In fact, it's undermining real science.
So in other words, these are some grand claims by evolutionists, and when you read the fine print, it says, no evidence remains. And again, this is the very definition of faith. You're assuming something without any evidence. So this directly goes with our second definition of faith. A belief that does not rest on logical proof or material evidence. No traces remain, no evidence remains. Ken Hovind said the same thing, where he's talking about the Darwin's tree of life.
So according to them, for the next few billion years or hundreds of millions of years, life learned to produce something other than its own kind. Of course, today everything only produces its own kind, but they say long ago and far away, they were able to do something different. Textbooks will say we started like a bacteria and slowly evolved to a human. I think that's stupid. But if you want to believe that, that's perfectly fine. Those trees of life that they put in the textbooks for your kids are a bunch of nonsense. And even evolutionists will admit that. Stephen Jay Gould, the Marxist professor at Harvard University, he says that evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks are not the evidence of fossils. It's only inference. We infer, we imply, we hope it happened this way. This textbook says, all the many forms of life on Earth today are descended from a common ancestor. What? You mean the birds and the bananas have a common ancestor? Isn't that what he says? Found in a population of primitive unicellular organisms. Well, in the first place, there's no such thing as a primitive unicellular organism, okay? One single cell is more complex than a space shuttle. There's no such thing as a primitive single-celled organism. We talk about that on video number 4 of our series. But he says, all the forms of life are descended from a common ancestor found in a population of primitive unicellular organisms. What were those first cells like? How do we know? What events led up to their formation? No traces of those events remain. Did you catch that? Hey kid, we know what happened, but there's no proof. Primitive, huh? This one says the humans, mammals, birds, crocodiles all had a common ancestor. Well, anything inside that circle is religious speculation. It is stupid. Reptiles produce reptiles, dogs produce dogs, people produce people, and there's never been an exception to that.
What about the idea of macroevolution versus microevolution? Jerry Coyne says this. Remember that the issue is not whether macroevolutionary change happens. We already know from the fossil record that it does. But whether it was caused by natural selection and whether natural selection can build complex features and organisms. But again, creationists are challenging this very notion, and they're saying that, well, there's no evidence for this. What they have is fossils that they put their own story on. So is that true? In this ministry, in this channel, we're trying to clearly listen to both sides. Because Jerry Coyne is making a truth statement here. Macroevolution absolutely happens. But William Dembski would directly challenge this notion. What evidence there is supports limited variation within fixed boundaries, or what typically is called microevolution. Macroevolution, the unlimited plasticity of organisms to diversify across all boundaries, even if true, cannot legitimately be attributed to the mutation selection mechanism. To do so is to extrapolate the theory beyond its evidential base. The difference between micro and macro is assumed by evolutionists, might be true, as William Dembski says, but it goes just beyond the evidence. So you can't say it's part of fact. Creationists would say that this would be part of faith. You can't prove it directly. So in this episode, I'm going to answer this question. Is evolution religious in nature? And also the second question is, must evolution account for the origin of life, the universe, and everything? So they're making this claim that evolution equals religion. Creationists are trying to make the case that yes, it is part of religion. But evolutionists are saying, no, evolution is pure science. Answers in Genesis said that creation and evolution are equally scientific and religious. The controversy is not religion versus science, but the science of one religion versus the science of another religion. But evolutionists are saying, no, evolution is the branch of science that explains biodiversity. There's no faith, there's no supernatural explanations. So, to sum up what we've learned in this episode, AronRa was asking the following questions. His fifth foundational falsehood stated that evolution is the religion of atheism, is the claim by creationists. And the sixth foundational falsehood, evolution must account for the origin of life, the universe, and everything. So this question, why do creationists say evolution is a religion? And we're asking the specific question, does evolution require faith? The definitions of faith, as we learned from before, a confident belief in the truth, value, or trustworthiness of a person, an idea, or a thing, or a belief that does not rest on logical proof or material evidence. Does evolution fit with the definition of faith? Well, the evolutionists are clearly saying that first, science is not a faith. It demands evidence for claims. Whereas in direct opposition, faith means to believe without evidence. They go on to say that faith assumes its own conclusions. AronRa would continue. Creationists know science isn't based on faith, but they say it is anyway. And finally, they're saying that you can't rely purely on faith. So this question, do evolutionists believe in things just beyond the evidence? Lee Strobel had these ideas. You have to believe that nothing produced everything. Non-life produces life. Randomness produces fine-tuning. Chaos produces information. Unconsciousness produces consciousness. Non-reason produces reason. And all of these ideas are just beyond the evidence. Well, AronRa is saying in his sixth foundational falsehood that evolution must account for the origin of life, the universe, and everything. And this just isn't what evolution is about. He's saying that creationists insist that evolution means the godless origin of life. But how it got here is not related to how it evolved. Creationists insist life from non-life, how it diversified, not how it began. But creationists are saying that all of these ideas are just beyond the evidence. You cannot just assume a naturalistic origin when there's no evidence to support it. You cannot just assume macroevolution when there is no evidence to support it. You cannot just assume things just beyond the evidence when there is no evidence to support it. You cannot just assume what happened in the past when no one was there, and you can't study it directly. William Dembski said that what evidence there is supports limited variation within fixed boundaries, or what typically is called microevolution. To do so is to extrapolate the theory beyond its evidential base. So in other words, you can't just go beyond the evidence. That is the very definition of what faith is. Belief that does not rest on logical proof or material evidence. Hebrews chapter 11. Let's try reading this in the King James Version to hear it in a different way. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good report. Through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. Verse 6. But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. By faith Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world, and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing whither he went. May God add blessing to the reading of his word. Well, in the next episode, we're going to explore more reasons why creationists say that evolution has religious elements to it. We're going to talk about things like you can't directly study the past. That's an inference which would make it a part of faith. We're going to look at Ken Ham's presuppositionalist approach. We're also going to look at factuality and scientific narrative, or these so-called just so stories. A story that was given in lieu of evidence. Been my pleasure to be part of this journey. We're open to both sides. We're trying to figure out what's part of fact, what's part of faith, what's part of feeling. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Remember, this series is all about listening with respect. That's what this channel is all about. I'm listening to what everyone has to say. Will you listen with me? So this is a YouTube channel, so I would ask that you like this video if you liked it, and subscribe to this channel. By subscribing, it gives me excitement to continue, and it helps my numbers to grow. Let's listen together. Have a great day. See you next time. Bye-bye.